Welcome to Ruud's History and Philosophy vlog. In this episode we will talk about the Prussian way of war. Victor Davis Hanson has argued that there is a Western way of war, a war that is based on so-called Western principles and adopted by so-called Western nations. With a broad brush he would draw a picture that this way of war existed from ancient Greece to modern times. I would argue against this kind of generalization. In this first episode of a series about warfare in history, I will delve into the way the Prussian nation has waged war for 2 centuries, roughly between 1740 and 1945. In 1740, Frederick II became King of Prussia. He inherited a rather poor and small country, but a large standing army, which his father had painstakingly created but never used. That same year Frederick would embark on a campaign of conquest, which would characterize the Prussian way of war for the 2 centuries to come. The hallmark of Prussian warfare was the quick mobilization and invasion of enemy territory before the enemy could muster its strength. That is what he did in 1740, when Frederick marched with his army into Austria's province of Silesia in the dead of winter and occupied it without resistance. Frederick struck before the army could muster his troops and to defend the border. This swift stroke played out well because Austria could not strike back immediately. There was no military campaigning in winter and it would have been impossible to cross the Sudeten mountains with a large army. When the Austrians started their campaign in the spring of 1741, the Prussian army was firmly established in Silesia and waiting for the Austrian army. Due to the outbreak of the War of Austrian Succession, the Austrians concluded a peace with Frederick, which led to the permanent acquisition of Silesia in 1742. In 1756, Frederick pulled off the same trick with the small kingdom of Saxony. He would quickly mobilize his army and occupy the country before the enemy could deploy his forces. This way, he managed to surround the Saxon army and fight off the belated Austrians. The conflict expanded, however, and this meant that Prussia had to fight on 3 fronts. This time the Austrians could bear their full weight on Prussia, and only a separate peace with Russia staved off disaster for Frederick. Frederick's way of waging war was a quick mobilization and driving the war into enemy territory as quick as possible. It was an offensive approach with an emphasis on surprise and mobility. The goal was to defeat the enemy before he could muster its full potential. The weaknesses of this way of war were twofold. First, hostile alliances between superpowers, like the alliance between Austria and Russia during the above-mentioned 7 Years' War. And second, a war of attrition, because the Prussian economic and manpower base was small. Another weakness of the Prussian way of war was that it was based on a war on its own terms, preferably a war one-on-one. It was hard for Prussia to deal with wars which were imposed on her. In Napoleon, the Prussians found their superior. Napoleon fought on the same principles as the Prussians. A swift campaign to prevent the army from mustering their full force and linking up with allies. When Napoleon attacked Prussia in 1806, he did just that, inflicting a national trauma on Prussians. Prussia did not fare well in defense. After the Prussians managed to defeat Napoleon in a traditional coalition campaign in 1813 and 1815, They saw an opportunity to rejuvenate their particular way of war of quick campaigning thanks to the invention of the railroad. The railroad was instrumental in the quick mobilization against the Austrians in 1866. They managed to drive the war into Austrian territory and with an offensive campaign managed to defeat them before they could muster their full potential. In 1870, the Prussians pulled off the same trick against France. Quick mobilization and invasion of French territory. By this highly mobile campaign, they managed to corner the French field army at Sedan. After this war, the French were hell-bent on revenge. They knew after 1870 that the rail network was vital for success against Prussian Germany. They also knew that the Achilles heel of the Prussian way of war was a war on multiple fronts. France sought and found an alliance with Russia and invested huge amounts of money to improve the Russian rail network, much to the despair of the Prussians. The problem with the Prussian way of war is that it required quick mobilization and a decisive offensive into enemy territory, but there was no room for a plan B. As soon as a large-scale Prussian offensive was effectively stopped, the Prussian army resembled a beached whale. It was deprived of vital resources in a hostile environment. This happened in France in 1914 and in Russia in 1941. In both situations, the Prussian army was forced to fight a war of attrition, which it ultimately lost after 4 years. The Prussian way of war knew a small revival between 1939 and 1941. When it overran smaller isolated countries in surprise attacks, like Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries and Yugoslavia. The victory over France in 1940 was impressive, but it was largely won by deceiving the Allies about the main thrust of attack. The element of mobilization, surprise and invasion in enemy territory was lost in 1939, and therefore the Germans had to resort to deception rather than their usual way of war. The Prussian-style invasion of Russia in 1941, however, proved to be the undoing of Germany. Despite the mass mobilization, the element of surprise and the deep penetration, the Russians managed to recover from their initial defeats. The Prussian way of war had finally failed. We can summarize the following. The Prussian way of war was initiated by Frederick II in the middle of the 18th century and was based on full-scale mobilization, surprise attack and quick campaigning. It was, however, a single-shot strategy. Once failed, there was no alternative. Nevertheless, it became the bread and butter of Prussian strategic thinking. It yielded enormous successes, notably under Frederick the Great and Bismarck, but also disastrous defeats under Wilhelm II and Adolf Hitler. The demise of Prussia as a state entity and a society also meant the end of the Prussian way of war waged by Prussians. Despite this fact, the Prussian way of war haunted Europe as a prospect during the Cold War. The idea of a mass surprise attack of a Russian tank force penetrating deep into Western Europe before NATO could muster its strength was the #1 scenario in NATO planning. The fall of the Soviet Union led this phantom finally to rest.